Tonight's story takes us to a peaceful corner of a quiet realm, where preparations are being made. Not with hurry or worry, but with the kind of gentle purpose that comes when time moves slowly, and there's nowhere else you need to be. In a valley where the morning mist liked to linger until nearly noon, there stood a cottage with a thatched roof and windows that glowed amber in the early light. The cottage belonged to Maren, a wanderer who had been resting here for the turning of 3 seasons. She had arrived in autumn, when the leaves were gold, and now spring was showing its first tender greens. Maren woke slowly, as she always did, to the sound of birds discussing the day outside her window. She lay there for a moment, watching dust motes drift through a beam of sunlight, spiraling lazily in no particular direction. There was no urgency in the way she rose from bed, pulling on her worn linen shirt and comfortable trousers, each movement unhurried and deliberate. Today, she would prepare for a journey. Not because she had to, but simply because it felt like time. The road was calling in that gentle way roads do, a whisper rather than a shout, a suggestion rather than a demand. She padded barefoot across the smooth wooden floor to the kitchen, where she filled a copper kettle with water from the well bucket. The water was cool and clear, and she took a moment to appreciate how it caught the morning light. While the kettle heated over the hearth fire, which she'd banked carefully the night before, Maren opened the window to let in the spring air. The breeze that drifted in smelled of wild herbs and distant flowers. Somewhere nearby, a creek was running, swollen with snowmelt from the mountains she could see on the horizon. Those mountains were where she would go, eventually. But not today. Today was for preparing. She made herself a simple breakfast, bread from the village baker, toasted slowly over the fire until it was golden, some soft cheese from a neighboring farm, a handful of early strawberries, still cool from the morning. She ate at the small table by the window, chewing slowly, watching the valley wake up around her. After breakfast, Maren began gathering the things she would need. She moved through the cottage with quiet purpose, running her hands over various objects, remembering their stories. A warm cloak of forest green wool, thick and soft, which had kept her comfortable through many nights under the stars. A leather satchel, well worn and reliable, with pockets that seemed to know what she needed before even she did. She packed a small tin cup, lightweight and dented from years of use. A fire-starting kit wrapped in oilcloth. A journal with pages that were starting to yellow, and a pencil she'd sharpened just last week. A length of sturdy rope, coiled neatly. These were the essentials, nothing more than what she could carry comfortably, nothing less than what would serve her well. There was a knock at the door. Soft, almost apologetic. Maren smiled, knowing who it would be. "Come in, Finn," she called, and the door opened to reveal a young fox. Well, not exactly a fox, but a fox person, with russet fur and kind amber eyes. Finn was a messenger of sorts, though he mostly carried news between friends rather than anything official. He wore a vest with many pockets and a scarf that seemed unnecessarily long. "I heard you might be leaving soon," Finn said, settling himself into the chair across from Maren. His tail curled around his feet in that contented way tails do when there's no hurry. Thought I'd see if you needed any provisions from the village. That's thoughtful of you, Maren replied, pouring him some tea from the pot she'd been steeping. The tea was chamomile and mint, calming and clear. I'm well supplied, but the company is welcome. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their tea. Through the window, they could see the valley spreading out below, a patchwork of fields and forests, streams and stone walls. A few cottages dotted the landscape, their chimneys sending up lazy spirals of smoke. Where will you go? Finn asked eventually, though his tone suggested he wasn't concerned about the answer. More curious than anything else. North, Maren said simply. Through the foothills, perhaps along the old trader's path. I've heard there are meadows there that bloom with lupines this time of year. Entire hillsides of purple and blue. That sounds lovely, Finn said, and meant it. After Finn left, Maren continued her preparations. She went to the small garden behind her cottage, where she'd been growing herbs and vegetables. The garden would be fine without her. It had managed before she arrived, and it would manage after she left. Still, she watered the plants one more time, speaking softly to them as she did, thanking them for the meals they'd provided. She pulled a few carrots, brushed off the dirt, and added them to her provisions. Some dried mushrooms from the cellar, carefully wrapped. A small jar of honey from the bees that lived in the hollow oak at the edge of the property. She wouldn't take much, just enough for a week or two on the road. The rest would be here when she returned, if she returned. With Maren, destinations were always tentative, and that was exactly how she liked it. In the afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point and painted everything in warm, golden light, Maren sat on the doorstep of her cottage and attended to her boots. They were good boots, made by a craftsman 3 villages over, and they'd carried her through countless miles. She checked the stitching, applied some oil to keep the leather supple, and replaced one lace that was starting to fray. As she worked, a neighbor's cat, a large gray creature named Smoke, came to investigate. The cat settled beside her, purring like distant thunder, and Maren paused to scratch behind its ears. Smoke had no opinion about her leaving. Cats rarely do. They exist so completely in the present moment that future plans seem almost abstract to them. You'll keep an eye on things, won't you? Maren asked the cat, who responded by closing his eyes and purring louder, which Maren took as agreement. The afternoon stretched out peacefully, each moment blending into the next like watercolors on wet paper. There was no urgency in these preparations, no sense of rush or deadline. This was how Maren approached all things, with a gentle steadiness that made even significant changes feel natural and unhurried. She stepped back inside the cottage and looked around at the space that had been her home for these many months. Everything was tidy, everything in its place. The dishes were washed and stacked on the shelf. The fire was banked low. The windows were open just enough to let the air circulate. It looked exactly as a cottage should when its occupant is away for a while. Cared for, but not clinging. On the mantel above the fireplace, Maren placed a small stone she'd found by the creek, smooth and gray, with a single white stripe running through it. It was her way of marking time, leaving little pieces of herself in the places she'd been. Someday she might return and see this stone again, and remember the spring she spent in this valley, and smile. As the afternoon began its slow drift toward evening, Maren made one final round of the cottage. She touched the back of her favorite chair, ran her hand along the smooth surface of the table, stood for a moment in the doorway looking out at the valley that had been her view for so many mornings. She was grateful for this place, for the peace it had offered, for the gentleness of the days spent here. But she was also ready to see what lay beyond the next hill. She would leave in the morning, she decided. There was no rush tonight. Tonight, she would sleep in her comfortable bed one more time, under the familiar weight of her quilts, listening to the familiar sounds of this place. The journey could wait one more night. And so Maren made herself a simple dinner: soup with vegetables from the garden, bread with butter and honey. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching through the window as the sun began to paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. After dinner, she sat by the fire with a cup of tea, not thinking about much of anything, just being present with the warmth and the quiet and the gentle crackle of the logs. When full darkness came, bringing with it a blanket of stars, Maren finally made her way to bed. She lay there in the familiar darkness, feeling the peaceful weight of contentment, knowing that tomorrow would bring new sights and sounds, new paths to walk, new moments to experience. But tonight was for rest. For the deep, easy breathing of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. The cottage settled around her with small, comfortable sounds. The creak of timber, the whisper of wind in the eaves, the distant call of an owl asking questions of the night. And in this peaceful place, between preparation and departure, between one chapter and the next, Maren drifted gently towards sleep. Morning arrived the way it always does in the valley. Gradually, without announcement, as if the darkness simply decided to step aside and let the light have its turn. Maren woke to that soft gray time before true sunrise, when the world exists in shades of silver and lavender, and everything feels hushed and sacred. She lay still for a moment, listening. The birds were just beginning their conversations, tentative at first, a single voice here and there, then building slowly into their morning chorus. Through the window, she could see the mist lying thick across the valley, as if the land itself was still dreaming. There was no hurry in how Maren rose from bed. She moved through her morning rituals with the same gentle purpose she brought to everything. A splash of cool water on her face from the basin, brushing her hair and tying it back simply. Dressing in her traveling clothes, the comfortable trousers, the linen shirt, a vest with useful pockets, and finally, the green wool cloak that had become like a second skin to her over the years. She made tea and sat with it by the window, watching the mist slowly lift and reveal the landscape she'd come to know so well. The stone wall that wound along the hillside. The old oak tree that marked the boundary of the miller's property. The creek that caught the early light and turned it into liquid silver. This was her goodbye to this place. Not sad, not reluctant, but appreciative. A quiet thank you to the valley for holding her safely through the turning of the seasons. When her tea was finished, Maren gathered her packed satchel, settling its familiar weight across her shoulder. She picked up her walking stick, a piece of ash wood she'd found on a previous journey, smooth from use, exactly the right height. She took one last look around the cottage, and then she stepped outside into the cool morning air. The path that led away from her cottage was packed earth, lined with small stones that someone long ago had placed with care. Maren followed it slowly, her boots making soft sounds on the ground, her walking stick tapping a gentle rhythm. The world around her was still waking up, the dew heavy on the grass, spider webs strung between fence posts and made visible by tiny drops of moisture catching the growing light. She passed the neighbor's garden, where Smoke the gray cat sat on a fence post, watching her with those knowing eyes that cats have. Maren paused to say goodbye, running her hand along his soft fur one more time. The cat purred briefly, then went back to his morning observations, unbothered by departures or arrivals. The path led her through the village, though village was perhaps too grand a word for the small cluster of cottages and workshops that made up this community. This early, only a few people were about. The baker, of course, whose day began in the darkest hours so that fresh bread would be ready when others woke. Maren could smell the yeast and flour, the warm scent of baking that made the morning feel complete. She stopped at the bakery, where old Henrik was just pulling loaves from his stone oven. He was a man of few words, but his bread spoke volumes. Crusty on the outside, soft within, made with patience and skill. "Heading out?" he asked, though he could see the answer in her traveling clothes and the pack on her shoulder. "North," Maren said simply, and Henrik nodded as if this made perfect sense. He wrapped 2 small loaves in cloth and handed them to her, refusing payment with a gentle shake of his head. "For the road," he said. "May it be kind to you." Maren tucked the warm bread into her pack, thanking him with genuine warmth, and continued on her way. These small acts of kindness, they were what made leaving both harder and easier at the same time. Harder because she would miss this gentle community, easier because she knew she could always return to it. At the edge of the village, where the cultivated land gave way to wilder spaces, Maren encountered another traveler. This one was sitting on a stone wall, adjusting the straps of a large pack. The traveler was tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich earth and hair that fell in thick locks past their shoulders. They looked up as Maren approached and offered a smile. "Good morning," the traveler said, their voice deep and resonant, like a cello in the lower registers. "I'm Dara. Also heading north, it seems." "Maren," she replied, returning the smile. "The path is more pleasant with company, if you'd like some." "I would," Dara said, standing and settling their pack more comfortably. "I was hoping someone might come along. Traveling alone is peaceful, but traveling together is peaceful in a different way." And so they walked together, these 2 wanderers, following the path as it climbed gently away from the valley. They didn't talk much at first. There was no need to fill the silence with words. Instead, they simply walked, finding a comfortable pace that worked for both of them. their footsteps creating a steady rhythm on the earth. The path led them through a forest of birch trees, their white bark glowing in the morning light that filtered through the canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with last autumn's leaves and this spring's first ferns, just beginning to unfurl their delicate fronds. Somewhere nearby, a stream was running, its voice adding to the peaceful soundscape of their journey. "I love this sound," Dara said eventually, pausing to listen. "Water finding its way downhill. It never worries about the destination, just follows the path of least resistance, adapting to whatever it encounters." Maren nodded, understanding. "There's wisdom in that," she said. "Perhaps we could all be more like water." They found a fallen log beside the stream and decided, without discussing it, to rest for a while. Both travelers shrugged off their packs and sat, letting the weight leave their shoulders. Maren pulled out the flask she'd filled with fresh spring water that morning, taking a long drink before offering it to Dara, who accepted gratefully. The stream before them moved over smooth stones, creating small eddies and pools where the light played on the surface. A water strider skated across one of the still places, leaving tiny dimples in its wake. Nearby, early wildflowers were blooming, small white ones that Maren didn't know the name of, and some bright yellow ones that Dara identified as marsh marigolds. "My grandmother taught me the names of flowers," Dara said softly, almost to themselves. She said that knowing something's name was the first step in truly seeing it. "Was she a wanderer too?" Maren asked. Dara shook their head, a gentle smile on their face. "No, she was rooted in one place her whole life. Had a garden that seemed to go on forever. But she always said that you could travel the world just by paying attention to what grew in your own backyard. Every plant had come from somewhere, had a story, had relatives in far-off lands." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the stream, watching the light move through the trees as the sun climbed higher in the sky. There was no hurry to their rest, no feeling that they should be moving on. Time, in moments like this, seemed less like a river flowing in one direction and more like a pool, where you could simply exist without the pressure of before or after. Eventually, in the natural way that all things move forward when they're ready, both travelers stood, shouldered their packs again, and continued along the path. The forest began to thin as they climbed higher, the birches giving way to pines, and the air taking on that particular clarity that comes with elevation. They emerged from the forest onto a hillside meadow, and both stopped to take in the view. Below them, they could see the valley they'd left, now looking small and distant, the cottages like toys, the fields like a patchwork quilt spread across the land. Ahead, the mountains rose in layers, each ridge a different shade of blue, growing hazier with distance until they almost merged with the sky. "It's moments like this," Maren said quietly, "that remind me why I walk." Dara nodded, understanding completely. Everything looks different from up here. Problems seem smaller. Possibilities seem larger. They stood there for a while, just breathing in the clean mountain air, feeling the sun on their faces, appreciating the simple fact of being alive in this moment, in this place, with this view spread out before them. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, its wings barely moving as it surveyed its domain. Both travelers watched it, envying its perspective perhaps, or simply enjoying the grace of its flight. When they continued walking, the path led them through the meadow, where the grass was long and soft, dotted with even more wildflowers. Bees moved among the blooms, their buzzing creating a drowsy sound that spoke of warm afternoons and endless summers. Butterflies floated past, their flight path random and unhurried, as if they too understood that the journey mattered more than the destination. Maren and Dara walked side by side when the path was wide enough, single file when it narrowed, always maintaining that comfortable rhythm they'd found together. Occasionally they would point something out to each other. A particularly beautiful flower, an interesting rock formation, a bird they'd spotted. But mostly they just walked, letting the peace of the journey settle into their bones. As the sun reached its high point, they found a spot beneath an old pine tree, its branches spreading wide to create a pool of shade. They decided this would be a good place for their midday rest, and both settled onto the soft carpet of pine needles, leaning back against the trunk, grateful for the coolness after walking in the sun. Maren pulled out some of the fresh bread from Henrik, along with cheese and a few early apples she'd brought. Dara contributed some dried fruit and nuts, and some kind of dense, sweet cake wrapped in wax paper. They shared their food companionably, eating slowly, savoring each bite. "Where are you heading?" Maren asked. "I mean specifically, if you have a specific place." Dara thought about this while chewing an apple slice. "There's supposed to be a monastery in the high mountains," they said eventually. "A place where they keep old books and manuscripts. I'm a scribe by trade, and I'd like to learn from their techniques, see what wisdom they've preserved." "And after that?" Maren asked. Dara smiled. "After that, who knows? Maybe back down to the lowlands. Maybe further north. Maybe I'll stay at the monastery for a season. The road will tell me when I get there." Maren understood this completely. It was the wanderer's way. To have a direction but not be bound by it. To have intentions but hold them lightly. They rested there in the shade for a good while, neither feeling the need to rush. Above them, the wind moved through the pine branches, creating that particular sound that pine trees make, somewhere between a whisper and a sigh. It was a sound that seemed designed for rest, for letting go of thoughts, for simply being present with the afternoon. And so they let themselves drift in that peaceful space between sleeping and waking, where the body rests but the mind is gently aware of birdsong and breeze and the filtered sunlight painting patterns on closed eyelids. When Maren and Dara finally stirred from their rest beneath the pine tree, the sun had moved considerably across the sky, painting everything in that particular golden light that belongs to mid-afternoon. Neither of them felt guilty about the time they'd spent resting. Time, after all, was something they had in abundance out here on the road, and rushing would only mean arriving at the next moment of rest more quickly. They gathered their things slowly, making sure nothing was left behind, though really there was no hurry. Dara stretched, reaching arms overhead and arching their back, working out the pleasant stiffness that comes from sitting still for a while. Maren rolled her shoulders and adjusted the straps of her pack, finding that perfect balance where the weight distributed evenly and felt almost like it wasn't there at all. "Ready?" Dara asked, though the question was more of a gentle invitation than anything requiring a definite answer. "Ready," Maren confirmed, and they set off again, following the path as it continued to climb gradually through the foothills. The landscape was changing as they gained elevation. The meadows here were wilder, less touched by human hands. The grass grew in thick tussocks, interspersed with hardy shrubs and clusters of wildflowers that seemed to bloom in defiance of the thinner air and cooler temperatures. The colors were more intense here. Deeper purples, brighter yellows, whites that seemed almost luminous in the clear mountain light. They walked through patches of lupines, exactly as Maren had hoped to find. The tall spikes of purple and blue flowers swayed gently in the breeze, creating waves of color that rolled across the hillside like a soft, living sea. Bees moved among them, heavily laden with pollen, moving from flower to flower with drowsy determination. "My grandmother would have loved this," Dara said softly, pausing to run their fingers gently over the lupine blooms. She always said that lupines were optimistic flowers, always reaching upward, always believing in the sun even when clouds covered the sky. Maren smiled at this, thinking about how every plant could be a teacher if you paid attention. The lupines did seem optimistic, standing tall and vibrant in this high meadow, their roots holding firm in the rocky soil, their blooms bright and unapologetic. They continued walking, and the path led them alongside a small creek that tumbled down from higher elevations. The water was so clear that every pebble on the bottom was visible, worn smooth by the patient work of flowing water over countless years. They could see small fish darting in the pools, quick flashes of silver that disappeared almost as soon as they appeared. The sound of the creek was companionable. Not too loud, not too quiet, just a steady murmuring that seemed to encourage wandering thoughts and gentle daydreams. Maren found herself thinking about nothing in particular, just letting her mind drift like a leaf on the water, touching this thought and that one lightly before moving on. They came to a place where the creek widened into a small pool, and without discussing it, both travelers decided this would be a good spot to refresh themselves. They set down their packs and knelt by the water's edge. The water was cold, mountain snowmelt, probably, making its way down to join larger streams in the valleys below. They cupped their hands and drank, gasping a little at the chill, then laughing at the shared experience. Maren splashed some water on her face and neck, feeling instantly more awake and present. Dara did the same, and then sat back on a flat rock, letting their feet dangle in the water for a moment. "That's cold," Dara said with a slight laugh, but they didn't pull their feet out. "Feels good though. Reminds you that you're alive." They sat there by the pool for a while, just existing in that moment. A dragonfly appeared, its wings catching the light like stained glass, hovering over the water before darting away on some errand only it understood. Small water birds. Maren thought they might be dippers, hopped along the rocks at the creek's edge, occasionally dunking their heads beneath the surface in search of food. After a time, they dried their feet on the grass and put their boots back on, lacing them carefully. There was something meditative about these small tasks, tying boots, adjusting straps, checking that everything was secure. Each action was simple and contained, requiring just enough attention to keep the mind focused but not so much as to create any stress. The path continued to follow the creek upstream, and they walked on, still maintaining that easy pace they'd found. The afternoon was wearing on, but there was no concern about finding a place to spend the night. These things had a way of working out. A sheltered spot would present itself when the time was right, as it always did for those who walked without anxiety. They passed through a grove of aspen trees, their leaves already beginning to show the first hints of the gold they would become in autumn. The leaves quivered in the slightest breeze, creating that distinctive sound that aspens make, like soft applause, or rain on a roof, or the whisper of 1,000 quiet conversations happening all at once. Beneath the aspens, the ground was soft with years of fallen leaves, and their footsteps made almost no sound. It felt like walking through a cathedral, the tall white trunks like columns, the canopy of leaves filtering the light into something soft and green and holy. Neither Maren nor Dara spoke as they walked through this grove. Some places seemed to ask for silence, not out of reverence exactly, but out of a desire not to disturb the peace that already existed there. When they emerged from the aspen grove, they found themselves in another meadow, this one even higher than the ones before. Here, the flowers were smaller, closer to the ground, adapted to the wind and the shorter growing season. But they were no less beautiful for their modest size. Tiny alpine flowers in shades of pink and white and purple, scattered across the grass like stars. In the distance, they could see a rocky outcrop, and beyond it, the mountains proper began, rising up in earnest now, their peaks still holding patches of snow even though spring was well advanced. But those mountains were still far off, perhaps several days' journey at their current pace. And that was perfectly fine. There was no deadline to meet, no appointment to keep. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon now, though it was still hours from setting. The light was taking on that warm, honey-colored quality that makes everything look softer and more forgiving. Shadows were growing longer, stretching across the meadow like dark fingers reaching toward the east. Dara spotted something and pointed. "Look there," they said quietly. "Deer." Maren followed their gaze and saw them. A small group of 3 deer grazing at the far edge of the meadow. They were too distant to make out much detail, but she could see their graceful forms, the way they moved, heads down then up, alert but not afraid, part of this landscape in a way that she and Dara were only temporary visitors to. They stood still and watched the deer for several minutes, not wanting to disturb them. Eventually, the deer moved off, disappearing over a rise, and the 2 travelers continued their own journey. "I wonder what it's like," Maren said, almost to herself, "to know one place so thoroughly. To have a home range that you travel every day, knowing every stone and stream and tree." "Different from what we do," Dara replied. "Not better or worse. Just different. They have depth of knowledge about one place. We have breadth of knowledge about many places. Both ways of being have their wisdom." They walked on, the path now leading them toward a gentle rise. As they climbed, the view opened up even more, showing them the country they'd already covered. The valley far below, now blue with distance, the forests they'd passed through, the meadows they'd crossed. It was satisfying to see how far they'd come, even though the journey itself had felt effortless, more like being carried by the day than forcing progress through it. At the top of the rise, they found a flat area with some large boulders scattered about, and they decided without needing to discuss it that this would be a good place to rest again before continuing. They settled onto the sun-warmed rocks, which held the heat of the afternoon like natural benches designed specifically for weary travelers. From this vantage point, they could see in all directions. Behind them, the way they'd come. Ahead, the way they were going. To the sides, more meadows and forests, more hills and valleys, the kind of landscape that made you understand why people wrote songs and poems about mountains and wild places. They sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but comfortable in the shared space. Maren pulled out some of the dried fruit Dara had contributed earlier and nibbled on it slowly. Dara took out a small leather journal and a charcoal pencil and began sketching the view, their hand moving slowly across the page, capturing the shapes of the distant mountains, the curve of the valley below. The breeze at this height was steady and cool, carrying with it the scent of pine and granite and high meadow grasses. It ruffled their hair and tugged gently at their clothes, but it wasn't unpleasant, more like the touch of a friendly hand, reminding them of the world's presence. A raven flew past, its wings making that distinctive whooshing sound, and it called out once, a deep, resonant sound that echoed slightly off the rocks. Then it was gone, gliding on the wind towards some destination known only to itself. Time passed in that unhurried way it has when you're not watching it, when you're simply being present with the moment. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky. The shadows continued to lengthen. The breeze continued to blow. And Maren and Dara continued to rest on their sun-warmed rocks, content in their stillness, grateful for the journey, in no hurry at all to arrive anywhere but exactly where they were. Eventually, as the afternoon began its slow transformation into evening, Maren and Dara gathered themselves once more. The sun was lower now, painting everything in shades of amber and rose, and there was a quality to the light that felt both full and fading, the day not ending so much as gently releasing its hold on the world. They descended from their rocky perch and continued along the path, which now began to curve around the side of the mountain rather than climbing steadily upward. This suited them both. A gentle traverse that required less effort, allowing them to simply walk and observe, their breathing easy and their steps light. The path led them through an area where the ground was covered in soft moss, thick and green and springy beneath their boots. It felt like walking on the most luxurious carpet ever woven, each step cushioned and quiet. Ancient trees grew here. Not the young aspens they'd passed through earlier, but old firs and hemlocks with trunks so wide it would take 3 people holding hands to circle them. These trees had stood here for longer than anyone could remember, their roots deep in the mountain soil, their branches home to generations of birds and squirrels and countless smaller creatures. There was a feeling of permanence here, of deep time, that made the concerns of any single day seem very small and very far away. Dara reached out to touch one of the massive trunks as they passed, pressing their palm against the rough bark. "Hello, old one," they said softly, and Maren understood this greeting completely. These ancient beings deserved acknowledgement, respect for their patient witness to the turning of seasons and years. The light filtering through the canopy here was dim and green, and the air felt cool and slightly damp. Mushrooms grew in clusters at the bases of trees and on fallen logs, some bright red with white spots, some pale and delicate as paper, some looking like tiny shelves stacked one upon another. Dara paused occasionally to examine them, their scribe's eye appreciating the intricate patterns and forms. "Nature is the greatest artist," Dara said, crouching to look at a particularly beautiful cluster of fungi that glowed faintly golden in the dim light. "And the most patient. These probably took weeks to grow, and they'll be gone in days, and no one will remember them except us." "Then we're honored to see them," Maren replied, kneeling beside Dara to appreciate the small, temporary beauty. They stayed there for a moment, two travelers paying attention to something small and fleeting, and somehow that felt like the most important thing they could be doing right then. As they continued walking, the forest began to open up again, and they emerged onto a hillside where the trees were more scattered, allowing the evening light to pour through in great golden shafts. Everything the light touched seemed to glow. The grass, the wildflowers, even the stones along the path appeared gilded and precious. They came upon a small stone structure, not quite a building, more like a shelter with 3 walls and an open front, its roof made of overlapping slabs of slate that had weathered to a beautiful silver gray. Someone at some time long ago had built this for travelers like themselves, a place to rest or wait out weather, a small gesture of kindness from one wanderer to those who would come after. "Shall we stay here for the night?" Maren asked, though she already knew the answer. It was perfect, sheltered but open to the view, dry and protected, with soft grass nearby where they could spread their bedrolls. "Yes," Dara agreed. "This feels right." They spent the next while making camp, though that was perhaps too grand a word for their simple preparations. They laid out their bedrolls in the shelter, positioning them so they could look out at the view as they fell asleep. They gathered some fallen branches for a small fire, though they didn't light it yet. The evening was still warm, and there would be time for fire when true darkness came. Maren found a flat stone that made a good seat and settled onto it, pulling out their provisions for the evening meal. Simple food, some of the bread, now a day old but still good, some hard cheese, dried apples, a handful of nuts. Dara contributed some herbal tea leaves wrapped in paper, which they could steep in hot water from their kettle. They prepared their meal without hurry, each small task given its full attention. Slicing the bread carefully, arranging the food on a cloth spread between them, filling the kettle from a nearby spring they'd spotted, a small seep in the rocks where crystal-clear water trickled out, cold and pure and tasting faintly of minerals and stone. While they worked, the sun continued its descent, and the sky began to put on its evening show. First came the deep golds and oranges near the horizon, then higher up, shades of pink and coral, and higher still, the blue of the sky deepening toward purple. A few early stars began to appear, faint at first, then growing brighter as the sky darkened around them. They ate their simple meal slowly, savoring each bite, washing it down with sips of cool spring water. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the small sounds of eating, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the whisper of breeze through the scattered trees. When the meal was finished and cleaned up, they decided it was time for the fire. Dara arranged the wood carefully, building a small structure that would catch easily and burn steadily. Maren struck her flint, and after a few patient tries, a spark caught in the tinder they'd prepared. They blew on it gently, encouraging it, and soon a small flame flickered to life. They fed the fire slowly, adding larger twigs, then small branches, building it up until they had a cheerful little blaze that pushed back the gathering darkness and created a bubble of warm, dancing light around them. The fire crackled and popped occasionally, sending small spirals of sparks up into the darkening sky, and both travelers watched these sparks rise and fade with quiet fascination. Fire has a way of focusing attention, of gathering thoughts and bringing people together. They sat on either side of it, the warmth on their faces, the light painting moving shadows on the stone walls of the shelter behind them. Dara put the kettle on to heat for their tea, and they waited in companionable silence for the water to boil. "Tell me something about your travels," Dara said eventually, their voice soft and unhurried. "A favorite memory, perhaps?" Maren thought about this, watching the flames dance. She had so many memories from so many roads. It was hard to choose just one. But eventually, a particular moment rose to the surface. "There was a morning," she began slowly, "in a place far to the east of here. I'd camped beside a lake, a huge lake, so big you couldn't see the far shore. I woke just before dawn, and the lake was completely still, like glass, and the sky was doing that thing it does sometimes where you can't tell where the water ends and the air begins." She paused, remembering, seeing it again in her mind's eye. And then the sun came up, and the whole lake turned gold. Not just the surface, but deep down too, like the light was shining from beneath the water as well as above it. And there were these birds. Hundreds of them. I don't know what kind. And they all took flight at once, their wings making this sound like applause, or wind in canvas sails. And I just stood there, water up to my knees, watching them, and I felt so completely present in that moment that everything else just fell away. Dara nodded slowly, understanding. "Those are the moments we travel for," they said. "Not the destinations, but those perfect, unexpected moments when the world shows you something you didn't even know you were looking for." The kettle began to whistle softly, and Dara removed it from the fire, pouring the hot water over the tea leaves in their cups. The scent that rose from the steeping tea was herbal and soothing. Chamomile, Maren thought, and maybe some mint, and something else she couldn't quite identify, but that smelled like meadows and summer and peace. They wrapped their hands around the warm cups, blowing gently on the surface of the tea to cool it, sipping carefully. The tea was perfect. Not too strong, not too weak, slightly sweet from some natural sugar in the leaves, warming them from the inside as the fire warmed them from the outside. Night had fully fallen now, and the stars were coming out in earnest. Away from any villages or towns, with no other lights to compete, The stars were overwhelming in their number and brightness. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and everywhere you looked, there were stars upon stars upon stars, each one a sun like the one that had just set, each one possibly with its own worlds, its own stories. My grandmother used to say that the stars were campfires, Dara said, looking up at the glittering sky. That every star was some traveler's fire, and we were all connected across the darkness by these little points of light. I like that, Maren said. It makes the night feel less empty, more like we're all part of something larger. They finished their tea in silence, letting the warmth settle into their bones, letting the peace of the evening wrap around them like a blanket. The fire burned lower, and they didn't add more wood. Just let it settle into glowing coals that pulsed gently with each breath of breeze. Around them, the night sounds began. The chirp of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature moving through the grass. These were comfortable sounds, the sounds of a world going about its business, neither threatening nor threatened, just existing, as it had existed for countless nights before this one and would exist for countless nights after. Maren and Dara made their way to their bedrolls, settling in for the night. The stone shelter still held some warmth from the day's sun, and their sleeping rolls were soft and familiar. They lay there, looking out at the stars, listening to the night, feeling the pleasant tiredness in their muscles from a day of walking. "Thank you for the company today," Maren said softly. "Thank you for sharing the road," Dara replied. And then there was only the sound of their breathing, gradually slowing, deepening, as sleep began to reach for them with gentle hands. Sleep came to them both the way it comes to those who have walked all day in clean air and sunshine. Easily, naturally, like water flowing downhill. Their breathing deepened and slowed, and the boundary between waking and sleeping blurred until it didn't matter which side they were on. Maren drifted in that peaceful space where dreams and memory blend together. She was walking again, but the path beneath her feet was made of starlight, soft and silver and slightly luminous. The trees around her were familiar but also strange, their leaves made of crystalline light, their branches reaching up to touch a sky that seemed both very close and infinitely distant. She wasn't alone. Dara walked beside her, though in the dream they didn't need to speak. Communication happened in a different way here. Through shared understanding, through the simple presence of companionship. They walked together through this dream landscape, and everything felt significant but not serious, meaningful but not heavy. The path led them to a clearing where a great tree stood, larger than any tree that could exist in the waking world. Its trunk was wide as a house, its branches spread across the entire sky, and in its branches lived all the birds Maren had ever seen, and many she hadn't. They sang together, creating a sound that was somehow both infinitely complex and perfectly simple. Beneath the tree, Dara's grandmother sat in a rocking chair, though Maren had never met her and didn't know what she looked like. But in the dream, she knew this was who it was. The old woman smiled at them both, her face kind and knowing, full of the wisdom that comes from paying attention to small things for a very long time. "You're doing well," the grandmother said, though her lips didn't move. The words just appeared in Maren's understanding, warm and approving. Keep walking. Keep noticing. Keep being present to what's in front of you. That's all any of us can do, and it's more than enough. The dream shifted the way dreams do, and Maren was no longer in the clearing but standing on a shore. The lake from her memory stretched out before her, that same impossible lake from the story she'd told earlier. But this time, when she looked down at the water, she could see straight through it to the bottom, and the bottom was made of stars, and she realized that the lake wasn't water at all but some kind of liquid light, and she could walk on it or through it or sink into it, and all of those options felt equally safe and equally right. She stepped onto the lake's surface, and it held her weight but also didn't. She was walking and floating simultaneously, and the sensation was like being cradled by something vast and gentle and completely trustworthy. The birds from the tree were here too, flying low over the lake, their reflections perfect in the mirror still surface, so that she couldn't tell if the birds were flying or the reflections were, or if it even mattered. Time in the dream was different than waking time. She might have walked across that lake for hours or for seconds. There was no way to tell, and no need to measure. She simply walked, and the peace of it filled her completely, washing away any small worries or concerns that might have been hiding in the corners of her mind. Eventually, gently, the dream began to fade, not ending exactly, but receding like the tide going out, leaving her on the shore of sleep itself, deep and restful and quiet. She wasn't aware of dreaming anymore, wasn't aware of much of anything except the profound rest of a body and mind completely at ease. Beside her, Dara was also deep in sleep, their own dreams carrying them through landscapes of memory and meaning. They dreamed of their grandmother's garden, but in the dream, the garden extended in all directions forever, each plant a doorway to somewhere else, each flower a small universe unto itself. They walked between the rows, running their hands over leaves that whispered secrets, stopping occasionally to smell a blossom that contained the scent of every season at once. In Dara's dream, they came to a fountain in the center of the infinite garden. The water flowed upward instead of down, reaching toward the sky in a gentle, impossible arc before dissolving into mist that smelled like rain and mint and fresh earth. They cupped their hands and the water flowed into them, cool and sweet, and when they drank, they understood something important. Though what it was would be forgotten on waking, leaving only the feeling of understanding, the memory of clarity without the specific details. Their grandmother was here too, tending plants that glowed with soft internal light. She looked up and smiled, her eyes crinkling in that way that meant she was genuinely pleased. "You've learned to see," she said. "Not just look, but really see. That's the gift I wanted to give you, and you've unwrapped it slowly, carefully, exactly as it should be unwrapped." Dara wanted to thank her, to tell her all the things they'd seen on their travels, all the beauty they'd noticed because she'd taught them how. But in the dream, she already knew. She'd always known. She was, in some way, present in every flower they'd ever stopped to examine, every leaf they'd ever sketched, every moment they'd paused to really see something instead of just passing it by. The dream garden began to fade, softening into darkness. But it was a comfortable darkness, a restful darkness, the kind that cradles rather than frightens. Dara sank deeper into sleep, their breathing slow and even, their face peaceful in the dim glow of the dying fire's coals. The night deepened around them both. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, following their ancient paths across the sky. The moon rose, a thin crescent like a gentle smile, casting just enough light to paint the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. An owl called from somewhere in the forest below, its voice carrying across the stillness, and somewhere far away, another owl answered. The fire had burned down to embers now, glowing softly like captured pieces of the sunset, pulsing gently with each breath of breeze. They gave just enough warmth to keep the chill of the mountain night at bay, but not enough to disturb the sleepers, who were wrapped in their blankets and lost in their dreams. Time passed in that way it does in the deep night, slowly and quickly at once, each moment eternal and fleeting. The earth turned, carrying them through the darkness toward another dawn, patient and inevitable, like it had done every night since the beginning, like it would do every night until the end. A fox passed by their camp, pausing briefly to look at the two sleeping humans, its eyes catching the ember light and reflecting it back in brief, golden flashes. It considered them for a moment. These strange creatures who traveled for no reason the fox could understand, who made fire and drank tea and told stories. Then it moved on, ghosting through the night on its own mysterious errands, leaving no trace except paw prints in the soft earth that would be gone by morning. The night creatures went about their business, mice searching for seeds, bats hunting insects on silent wings, a porcupine waddling past in search of tender bark, moths dancing in the thermal updrafts from the cooling earth. All of them moved through the darkness with confidence born of instinct and necessity, none of them concerned with the two travelers sleeping in the stone shelter. And through it all, Maren and Dara slept peacefully, their dreams growing lighter and more fragmentary as the night wore on, preparing them gently for the transition back to waking. Their bodies rested deeply, repairing the small damages of travel, storing up energy for the next day's journey. Their minds drifted through pleasant, forgettable dreams, walking through meadows, sitting by streams, watching clouds, simple and sweet and meaningless in the way that most dreams are. The stars began to fade as the first hint of pre-dawn light touched the eastern sky. It wasn't sunrise yet, more like the promise of sunrise, the world taking a deep breath before opening its eyes. The darkness began to thin, turning from black to deep blue to a soft gray that made shapes visible again. The outline of the mountains, the silhouette of trees, the curving line of the path. Birds began to wake, their first calls tentative and sleepy, as if they too were emerging from dreams and needed to remember what their voices sounded like. One bird called, then another, then several, building slowly into the morning chorus that would eventually fill the dawn with sound. In the shelter, Maren stirred slightly but didn't wake. Her sleep was too deep, too peaceful to be interrupted by something as gentle as distant birdsong. She turned onto her side, pulling her blanket more securely around her shoulders, and settled back into rest. Beside her, Dara remained motionless, breathing deeply and steadily, their face relaxed and peaceful in the growing light. The night was not quite over, but the transition had begun. That slow, gentle shift from darkness to light, from sleep to waking, from one day to the next. But there was no hurry. There never was. The sun would rise when it was ready, and they would wake when it was time, and the day would unfold at its own perfect pace, exactly as it should. The dawn came slowly, painting the sky in layers, first the deep gray that pushed back the night, then pale blue along the eastern horizon, then bands of pink and gold as the sun prepared to make its appearance. The process was gradual and unhurried, giving the world time to wake up gently, without shock or suddenness. Maren opened her eyes to this soft light, not starting awake but simply allowing consciousness to return naturally, like surfacing from deep water. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was. Then memory returned, bringing with it the pleasant recollection of yesterday's walk, the evening's fire, the peaceful sleep. She lay still for a while, warm in her bedroll, watching the sky continue to brighten. There was no reason to get up immediately. The morning was a gift, and gifts should be opened slowly, with appreciation for each layer of wrapping paper. Beside her, she could hear Dara's slow, even breathing. They were still asleep, and Maren was careful to be quiet, not wanting to disturb them. She propped herself up on one elbow and looked out from the shelter at the view that yesterday's evening light had shown them and that this morning's light was revealing again, different but equally beautiful. The valley below was filled with mist, making it look like a sea of white clouds with islands of hilltops rising above. The mountains in the distance were sharp and clear, their peaks catching the first rays of direct sunlight and beginning to glow with that particular rose-gold color that only appears in these earliest moments of day. A raven landed on a nearby rock, tilting its head to examine Maren with one bright eye. She nodded to it in greeting, and it made a soft, conversational croak. Not the harsh call ravens are known for, but something quieter, almost companionable. Then it spread its wings and lifted off, gliding down the hillside toward the misty valley below, disappearing into the white. Maren carefully extracted herself from her bedroll and stood, stretching gently, feeling the slight stiffness in her legs from yesterday's walking. It was a good feeling, an earned feeling, the body's way of saying it had been used for its intended purpose. She walked a little way from the shelter, finding a spot where she could watch the sunrise properly. The sun was just beginning to peek over the distant mountains now, its edge a brilliant line of light that was almost painful to look at directly. As she watched, more of it appeared, rising with that steady inevitability that had marked every dawn since the beginning of time. The light spread across the landscape, chasing away shadows, warming the air, painting everything it touched in shades of amber and honey. Birds were singing in earnest now, their morning songs filling the air with complex melodies. She could hear so many different voices, some clear and bell-like, some raspy and rough, some that trilled and warbled, others that called simple, repetitive notes. Together, they created something that wasn't quite music but wasn't quite random either. A natural symphony that needed no composer or conductor, only participants willing to add their voice. Behind her, she heard Dara stirring, the soft sounds of someone waking slowly and peacefully. She turned to see them sitting up, rubbing their eyes and smiling at the morning. "Beautiful," Dara said simply, looking at the sunrise, and Maren nodded because no other words were necessary. They emerged from the shelter together and stood side by side, watching the sun continue its climb. Neither felt the need to speak. The morning said everything that needed saying. After a while, they turned to their morning tasks. Dara rekindled the fire from last night's coals, blowing gently on them and adding small twigs until flames appeared again. Maren fetched water from the spring, filling their bottles and the kettle. They moved around each other easily, two people who had quickly learned each other's rhythms, who understood the value of companionable silence. They made a simple breakfast. Some oats cooked over the fire with dried fruit stirred in, tea steeped in hot water, some of the remaining bread toasted over the flames. They ate sitting on the flat rocks near the shelter, taking their time, appreciating the food and the morning and the fact of being alive to experience both. "I think I'll continue north today," Dara said eventually. "Toward that monastery I mentioned. I'm feeling drawn that way." Maren nodded, understanding. "I think I might stay in this area for a while," she said. "Explore these meadows. Maybe find a place to camp for a few days. I'm not ready to climb higher yet." There was no disappointment in this parting of ways, no sense of loss. They had shared a day and a night, had walked together for a while, and that was exactly the right amount of time. The road had brought them together, and now the road was gently suggesting they go their separate ways. This was how it worked for travelers. Meetings and partings, companionship and solitude, both valuable, both necessary. They cleaned up from breakfast and packed their things, taking their time, making sure nothing was left behind. They checked the fire carefully, making sure it was completely out, spreading the ashes and covering them with dirt. The stone shelter looked just as it had when they'd arrived, ready for the next travelers who might need it. When everything was ready, they stood facing each other, both smiling. Dara held out their hand, and Maren took it, and they shared a brief, warm handshake that somehow conveyed everything they wanted to say. "Thank you for the company. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for walking beside me for a while. May your road be kind. May you find what you're looking for. May we meet again someday or not, and either would be fine." "Travel safely," Maren said. "You too," Dara replied. And then Dara shouldered their pack and set off along the path that continued upward, toward the higher mountains and the monastery they sought. Maren watched them go, watched until they rounded a bend and disappeared from view, feeling the pleasant melancholy that comes with friendly partings. Not sad exactly, but aware of the passage of time, of the way people move through our lives like birds through the sky, briefly visible and then gone. She turned and looked in the other direction, where meadows spread out across the hillside, dotted with flowers and promising exploration. That was her direction, at least for today. Tomorrow might bring a different choice, a different path, and that was perfectly fine. That was the gift of the wanderer's life. Every day a choice, every morning a new beginning. Maren adjusted her pack, picked up her walking stick, and started down a smaller path that led toward the meadows. The morning sun was warm on her face, the breeze was gentle, and the day stretched out ahead of her, full of possibilities and free of obligations. As she walked, she thought about the journey so far. Leaving the valley cottage, the peaceful village, meeting Dara, the beautiful walk through forests and meadows, the evening fire, the dreams she could barely remember but that had left her feeling rested and peaceful. It had been a good beginning to her travels, and she was grateful for all of it. But she also wasn't dwelling on it, wasn't trying to hold on to it too tightly. The gift of travel was learning to appreciate each moment fully and then let it go, trusting that the next moment would bring its own gifts. Yesterday was beautiful, but today was here now, and that was what deserved her attention. The meadow grass brushed against her legs as she walked. Butterflies rose up from flowers and danced through the air. The mountains stood patient on the horizon, neither calling nor pushing away, simply being there, as they had always been, as they would continue to be long after she was gone. Maren walked slowly, in no hurry to arrive anywhere. Each step was complete in itself, requiring no justification, no goal beyond the simple act of walking. She was present to the warmth of the sun, the softness of the grass, the vast blue dome of the sky overhead. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, on a path through a meadow, under a morning sky, alive and aware and grateful. And so she continued, this small wanderer in this vast landscape, moving through the world with gentle purpose and open attention. The day would unfold at its own pace, bringing whatever it would bring. She would walk until she felt like resting, rest until she felt like walking, eat when she was hungry, sleep when she was tired. It was simple and it was enough. The path curved through the meadow, leading her toward a line of trees in the distance. Beyond those trees, she could see more meadows, more hills, more paths to explore. There were days and days of walking ahead, weeks or months if she wanted, an endless unfolding of steps and sights and small discoveries. But she didn't think about that. She thought about this step, and then the next one, and then the one after that. She thought about the flower blooming beside the path, the cloud drifting overhead, the bird singing from a distant tree. She thought about the simple pleasure of being in her body, moving through space, breathing clean air, feeling the earth solid beneath her feet. This was what she had set out to find. Not a destination, but a way of being. Not arrival, but journey. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but the beautiful, peaceful uncertainty of a life lived one step at a time, one moment at a time, one breath at a time. And so Maren walked on into her day, into her journey, into the continuing story of her travels. The sun climbed higher. The morning deepened. The world turned. And she walked, content and present, exactly where she needed to be. Which was here. Which was now. Which was always enough. And so we leave Maren here, walking through the meadow in the morning light, her journey continuing in ways we won't see but can imagine. More paths, more mountains, more moments of quiet beauty and simple peace. May her peaceful journey carry you into your own restful sleep, knowing that tomorrow, like every tomorrow, will bring its own gentle possibilities. Knowing that wherever you are, Whatever concerns you carried into this evening, you can set them down now and simply rest. The story continues, but you don't need to follow it anymore. You can let it fade, let Maren walk on without you, let the meadow blur into peaceful darkness, let your own dreams take over where this story leaves off. There's nowhere you need to be except right here. Nothing you need to do except breathe slowly, in and out, letting each breath carry you deeper into rest. The day is done. The night is here. And sleep is waiting patiently to welcome you home. Good night, and peaceful dreams.